Oh my goodness gracious. It is a whole new year, ladies and gentlemen, and I have finally reemerged from the cocoon I have been in since after putting out the Halloween Misfits episode. I was firmly ensconced, as I am every year, around Thanksgiving and Christmas time with two big weekend-long music charity productions, and just had no brain space for doing new research and doing more recordings. So thank you, if you are a long-term listener, for hanging in there and waiting for the next one to come. Here we are. It is what I've chosen to call the history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. But as always, you may call it what you like. Now today, finishing up Hank Williams in terms of the movie Your Cheatin' Heart from 1964. And again, I hope I said this on the previous one, but I can't remember. If you're a hardcore old school country fan, I apologize for the fact that you're going to have to hear a lot of interstitial music that's just bluesy, rock and roll, twangy, noisy, fuzzy, atmospheric things. Or not atmospheric in the case of other times. Because if you're unfamiliar with the show, half the point of me doing it is to toss in unused guitar demos I've recorded in my living room that I am either too lazy to workshop into songs or haven't done so yet due to limitations of band schedules. Like all that riffity-diffity-do there, that was just me trying out brand new pickups in my Hagstrom hollow body Viking. I ordered from Guitar Fetish pickups some of their Filtertron sort of rip-offs, and I really like them. Not a plug. We don't have any ads, don't have any sponsors as of this recording and release right now at the end of January 2023. So I appreciate it if you will share this with friends if you think they might like the show. Or if they don't like the show, you want to make them miserable, share it with them. There's also links in the description of this episode and every episode for ways to support, like simply following me on Instagram or donating some money directly to me or buying a t-shirt from my bonfire.com store. Just the worst shirts ever. Obviously, you can also email me directly at justtheworstever@gmail.com. I say obviously, and it's not obvious at all. I'm rambling. I just wrapped up recording the final part of the episode. Now I've gone back to the beginning to do the introduction because that's how I do things in an impractical way. I'm happy to return to Hank right now because, you know, I've had a couple things happen in my life that got me in the right mood to listen to some songs like, you know, a bucket's got a hole in it, and I'm so lonesome I could cry, and I'll never get out of this world alive. One of the big charity shows I was talking about in Seattle, I had to hobnob around and sort of try to avoid the aforementioned in the previous Hank episode five-time ex-girlfriend that was there, being a fantastic musician and playing with some other really talented people. It's annoying when your exes don't go away, and annoying when they are so deserving of attention and praise. It sucks, especially when they're good people and other people you know want them around. Also got laid off from my job. They announced 2 days before Christmas they were letting me go. And you might think, well, then you're probably a terrible employee, Jay Smith. And I would say, no, I was really good. I was there for 5 years. Everyone they promoted ahead of me left pretty quickly. And I covered for a lot of folks that made things difficult, that did bail on the company for years and years and years. But I made it known that in the new year, I would like to make a career change. If somebody was on the chopping block, then I would gladly put my head on it so that another person in my department wouldn't get punished. And then I go off and find another job 3 months later and feel bad about it. So I know that's not the kind of thing that most music podcasters probably talk about at the top of an episode. This is my show. It all got me in the mood to talk about Hank and revisit his body of work. Not the movies, though. The recordings of me talking about the movies come from the weekend where I watched 3 of them in a row and my initial reactions in real time while just pausing the film and giving you my first thoughts upon seeing certain scenes that leave an impact, which we'll start with next. All right, we got a success montage, and it is the leanest, laziest success montage I've ever seen. Maybe this is one of the earliest examples of the success montage in a rock and roll entertainment movie. When you have the sort of montage of headlines in newspapers, right? So the Acuff Rose Publishing Company decides they're going to take on everything he's got because he's such a good songwriter, and then they decide they're going to book him on the Louisiana Hayride, pronunciation mine because of the way we sang those songs in school as a kid. That like they show like the Shreveport Daily News, the Shreveport Bulletin, multiple times with like on the front page headline, Hank Williams to play the Louisiana Hayride. And that's how he gets like rich and famous. So they don't do like a montage of appearances. They don't do a montage of tours. They don't do a montage of like showing up at radio stations or anyone spinning a record album or a 45 or whatever on the air and saying, here's the newest hit from a young up-and-comer named Hank Williams. Nope. Just plays Shreveport a few times, and now he's got a house, and it's full of stuff. He's got a refrigerator. His wife's coming home in a great big car. There's a tricycle in the house, so clearly they've got a kid, or it's her kid that was mentioned earlier, I suppose. We haven't seen the child yet. And he's frustrated. He's just sitting on the couch with his guitar, writing on, ledgers, on sheets of manuscript paper. Not ledgers, I apologize, but it's on staff paper. And I think the very real thing to take away from that is the frustration and the feeling of being pinned down and the woe of someone who up until this point has been an active performer, and then they get a deal and there's people breathing down your neck for more content, as we would call it today, unfortunately. Everything about human civilization started going downhill as soon as we started calling art and literature and journalism content, I think. But I'm not the only one. I didn't come up with that at all. It's just that strange thing that happens in the brains of a lot of performing artists when they're stuck in hotels in a more modern, like the last 60 years kind of sense. And in Hank's sense, sitting at home on his couch with his guitar and just, writing on a manuscript paper, come up with stuff instead of being it, doing it, and being, I was talking to my friend Rick last night about the change in jazz music that happened when recordings became more prevalent and more prioritized. It used to be just jazz combos constantly recording a live set that they were used to doing and then moving on and doing things live and pushing each other to do different things live. And then it became about writing things for a recording, working things up for a recording and then stopping doing that material and moving on to new material. Or hearing other people around the country doing stuff, putting it out on a record and going, well, now we can't do what we were doing because it's all over the country now. We were doing something in a similar vein and now we have to just change what we're doing and move on faster. This is all speculation on our part. We are not jazz musicians in the 1940s or 50s or 60s, but that's how technology and media changes things. You know, we haven't talked about Hank for a while, so I thought maybe just a quick read from a book called It Still Moves, Lost Songs, Lost Highways, and the Search for the Next American Music from 2008 might be nice because the author, Amanda, Petrusich, has done as good a job as anybody that if you sort of force them to summarize the career of Hank Williams in one paragraph, this isn't too bad, I don't think. She sets up this part by discussing bluegrass and then getting into honky tonk, which she points out is named originally for songs based around a ragtime influenced piano boogie and later hopelessly conflated with the brand of country music played in honky tonks or Texas saloons. It emerged as a distinct new style in country music. Honky tonk country had to be particularly cacophonous in order to be heard above the standard barroom buzz, overpowering foot stomping and rowdy beer haulers by folding in closed chords, more bass, piano, and occasionally electric guitar and drums. The Texan Ernest Tubb is probably the most notable alumni of the honky tonk circuit, joining the Opry February 1943 and enjoying a long career recording electric riffs for Decca Records. So the paragraph about Hank starts here. Meanwhile, Hank Williams, a guitarist and singer from Alabama who supposedly learned his trade from a street-bound blues singer named T-Tot, also known as Rufus Payne, joined the Opry in November 1949 after a triumphant stint on Shreveport, Louisiana's brand new radio show, Louisiana Hayride. Williams was playing a bizarre blend of honky-tonk and traditional gospel and became one of country music's very first superstars, beloved for his grim, melancholy laments. Later, Western Swing, another country hybrid born from Southwestern honky-tonks, slapped together disparate bits of country, folk, polka, New Orleans jazz, blues, and swing, folding in drums, horns, saxophones mostly, piano, and pedal steel to form the traditional country sound. In 1953, Williams, long addicted to alcohol and morphine, was found dead in the backseat of a baby blue Cadillac, wearing cowboy boots and accompanied only by a few empty cans of Falstaff beer and the lyrics to an unrecorded, if creepily prescient, song titled Then Came That Fateful Day. Williams was 29 years old. Now, a lot of folks would say that doesn't summarize his life or career very well at all because there's not much in the way of personal details about his life or his romances or his hit records or anything like that. But I'm sort of fond of it or biased toward this sort of approach because it is putting him in the context of the musical scene and the recording industry in which he had such a huge influence and how it was changing even while, he was a superstar. Another section of this book that I think does him some justice as well is way, way, way later. And someone else is being interviewed, a Kentucky-born musician named J.D. Wilkes, Dead Kennedy's vocalist, punk force of nature and political firebrand, to say the least. Jello Biafra had dubbed Wilkes the last great rock and roll frontman, and the Shake Shackers' riotous live act is a notorious blend of spit and elbows, wickedly flailing feet, perfectly anchored by Wilkes' convulsive harmonica playing. I've heard the Shake Shackers before and loved what I heard. It's been a few years, though. That's all I can say. But I was really enjoying his quotes in this book and talking about country music in sort of a more modern sense. He immediately goes back to compare to Hank Williams Sr. I really hate alt country, Wilkes spits. I don't like dreary, forlorn, mundane music that wears a cowboy hat, but really has more in common with like the bleak dirges of art-damaged folkies. It's not fun at all. And I love it when they put out like a Hank Williams tribute record with all the latest alt country heroes, and they all take the life and the pulse and the spunk out of the songs. It's joyous music with painful lyrics, but they strip the joy out of it and just give you the pain. And it's maudlin and melodramatic and mundane as hell. And I want nothing to do with that style of music. And I'm sorry if we're involved in that whole thing, Wilkes hollers, his thin voice peaking, clearly agitated. I write country music. There's no need to alter it. The real stuff is good on its own. How can you improve on Carl Smith or Ernest Tubb or Bob Willis or Hank Williams? These guys are awesome. You should try and be the next one of those in your own style, which doesn't include wistful, teary-eyed, mealy-mouthed mewling. I just can't stand it. Old country is ornery, it's cantankerous, it's lively, it's got pain in its heart, but it's laughing to keep from crying. It's for dancing. But the Hank Williams tribute record is all postmodern, whiny baby crap with an acoustic guitar. It's more about the fucking hairdo than getting people up and rocking. Bam. Love it. I think that combination of joy and pain is sort of hearkening back to Irish folk music, you know, stuff you can dance to, jigs and reels, and or other, you know, or folk songs where a sad story is being told, but you're still celebrating life. All right, well, I was wrong again. God damn it. I can't predict the wily ways of the MGM musical, apparently. And we've already, at 36 minutes into this film, we've turned the marriage sour already. And we're laying the groundwork for all the great "Why the hell did I marry you?" and or "Why is our marriage so difficult 6 months into our married life?" Hank Williams songs. And I also wanted to bring up a quote from Terry Jones of Monty Python talking about the late, great Douglas Adams. If you've listened to every episode of the history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll, you've heard me talk about the fundamental interconnectedness of all things, which was something that I took from Douglas Adams, the writer of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, among other books, about, it was Terry Jones lamenting that Douglas had wanted to be a performer, a stage performer. He was big, tall, he was loud, he was intelligent, and unfortunately his greatest success was as a writer. Fate, Terry Jones said, had cast him as a writer. So instead of being on a stage in front of theaters full of people, he was trapped alone in a hotel room with a deadline set by a publishing company, which is exactly what we're seeing happen to Hank Williams at this part of the film. Now I want to read an excerpt from Mystery Train by Greil Marcus. And there's a little chunk here about country music. By the late 40s and early 50s, Hank Williams had inherited Jimmie Rodgers' role as the central figure in the music, but he added an enormous reservation. That margin of loneliness in Rodgers' America had grown into a world of utter tragedy. Williams sang for a community to which he could not belong. He sang to a God in whom he could not quite believe. Even his many songs of good times and good lovin' seemed to lose their reality. There were plenty of jokes in his repertoire, novelties like Colija, the tale of unrequited love between two cigar store Indians. He traveled Rodgers' road. But for Williams, that road was a lost highway. Beneath the surface of his forced smiles and his light, easy sound, Hank Williams was kin to Robert Johnson in a way that the new black singers of his day were not. Their music, coming out of New Orleans, out of Sam Phillips's Memphis studio, and washing down from Chicago, was loud, fiercely electric. raucous, bleeding with lust and menace and loss. The rhythmic force that was the practical legacy of Robert Johnson had evolved into a music that overwhelmed his reservations. The rough spirit of the new blues, city R&B, rolled right over his nihilism. Its message was clear. What life doesn't give me, I'll take. Hank Williams was a poet of limits, fear, failure. He went as deeply into one dimension of the country world as anyone could, gave it beauty, gave it dignity. What was missing was that part of the hillbilly soul Rogers had celebrated, something Williams's music obscured, but which his realism could not express, and the community's moralism could not contain. Excitement, rage, fantasy, delight, the feeling summed up in a sentence by W.J. Cash from The Mind of the South, that even in the southern physical world was a kind of cosmic conspiracy against reality in favor of romance. That even if Elvis's South was filled with Puritans, it was also filled with natural-born hedonists, and the same people were both. To lie on his back for days and weeks, Cash wrote of the hillbilly, storing power as the air he breathed stores power under the hot sun of August, and then to explode as that air explodes in a thunderstorm, in a violent outburst of emotion. In such a fashion would he make life not only tolerable, but infinitely sweet. In the 50s, we can hardly find that moment in white music, before Elvis. Hank Williams was not all there was. Sorry. Can you tell I'm not looking ahead fast enough? Hank Williams was not all there was to 50s country. But his style was so pervasive, so effective, carrying so much weight, that it closed off the possibilities of breaking loose, just as the new black music helped open them up. Not his gayest tunes, not Move It On Over, Honky Tonkin', or Hey Good Lookin', can match this blazing passage from Cash, even if those songs share its subject. To go into town on Saturday afternoon and night, to stroll with the throng, to gape at the well-dressed and the big automobiles, to bathe in the holiday cacophony, maybe to have a drink, maybe to get drunk, to laugh with the passing girls, to pick them up if you had a car, or to go swaggering or hesitating into the hotels with the corridors saturated with the smell of bichloride of mercury, or the secret, steamy, bawdy houses, maybe to have a fight, maybe against the cops, maybe to end whooping and goddamming in the jailhouse. Now let's talk about getting arrested and going to jail. Let's talk about that in relation to Hank Williams. But first, a quick aside. Mercury bichloride was used at the time to treat syphilis infections, and people would rub a solution of it on their skin lots of times before going to bed. And it ended up leading to lots of poisonings, accidental deaths, suicides, things like that when taken in other forms. So it's an episode that spawned a fairly famous black and white photograph of him from his arrest in 1952. And there's a few blog entries out there specifically about that arrest and showing that image. It looks pretty ghastly, I'd say. He's definitely very malnourished and seems to be screaming at the camera. I assume they took that photo while processing him. And what leads up to this is him losing a job with, losing his bookings on the Grand Ole Opry and WSM. He'd been fired for being a chronic no-show. There was no chance for him to sort of talk his way out of it. It was supposedly a corporate decision. But if Hank would straighten up and conduct himself right for a year, then he could call back. The man named Denny, who fired him, was in the presence of the legend Ernest Tubb when this phone call happens. Tubb reminds Denny at this time that he, Ernest, had noticed a few months earlier Hank was getting on the edge and had told Denny that he should take him off the road for a while, but Denny ignored that. Executives still regarded singers as semi-bright slaves, writes Chet Flippo in Your Cheatin' Heart, a biography of Hank Williams. And Denny himself started at WSM as a broom jockey, but he had developed the proper executive arrogance as he rose up through the ranks. Executives had to be tough, he was taught. Everybody involved in the firing of Hank Williams, all the top executives, said that it wasn't their decision, it was a corporate decision. Denny, Fred Rose, WSM program manager Jack Stapp, WSM president Jack DeWitt, WSM advertising director Irving Waugh, WSM chief engineer George Reynolds, and National Life and Accident Insurance Company president Edwin Craig. They had all heard the rumors and decided that Hank Williams was a bad risk and a negative factor and a poor representative when it came to projecting an advertising image, not at all what they needed. And I bring all this up, and I'm reading directly from the text because it's so nicely organized there, to further contextualize the career of Hank Williams and the business at the time. He's not just some like rough troubadour individualist that, well, I mean, he is those things, but he didn't get successful being alone, and, you know, he didn't just come from out of nowhere. He had a lot of support from this chunk of the industry, such as it was at the time, and they were doing things the way corporate insurance men knew how to do things. There wasn't a lot of competition. Like he couldn't just go, you know, I think, you know, Clear Channel was something that started early in the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken, but it wasn't like there were competing radio networks. He could just jump from one to the other and like sort of like start a bidding war, especially with his reputation, especially with, you know, what I believe I brought this up on the previous Hank Williams episode. One of the most, I don't know, crazy things, the original elements of his career and story that blew my mind was how many bridges he was able to burn because he was so popular. He didn't travel out of the territory regularly. He stayed within a small, you know, network of places until he had just, you know, no-showed so much or gotten in so many fights or caused so many fights that he just couldn't work for long periods of time in those areas. He didn't just go from town to town, state to state, and coast to coast like other people would, because he was so popular that people didn't want to let him go. They could make a lot of money off of him if he stayed around. So when Hank gets the call, a gentleman's with him in the room named Johnny Wright, and Hank is on the phone with Denny, telling him to check the fucking Billboard charts and then call him back, because Jambalaya was becoming a hit really, really fast, and Setting the Woods on Fire was a pick hit in Billboard magazine at the same time. Jambalaya is very soon about to be number one. But WSM insists it could not employ a person like Hank Williams, and it didn't. Ernest Tubb, on the other end, in Denny's office, walks out and is getting into his car in the parking lot and encounters a man named Edwin Craig, chairman of the board of National Life and Accident Insurance Company, which owned WSM and sponsored the Grand Ole Opry. He approached him and stopped Tubb while he's getting in his car. It says, "Ernest, I hear that Jim just fired Hank Williams." "Yes, sir, Mr. Craig, he did. He told him he did it to straighten him up." Ernest was amazed to have an executive address him directly. Craig said, "Well, I hope Jim knows what he's doing, because it could help Hank and it could kill him." "That's right, sir." Backstage, the Grand Ole Opry, after the word gets around, people are telling jokes, people are whooping it up. There's a lot of folks that have a grudge against Hank, don't like the way he acts, don't like the way he behaves, talking about some chickens coming home to roost, as they say, discussing times like when he walked into the Last Frontier Casino in Las Vegas, automatically checked the jukebox to see how many of his records were on it, and finding none, he went out and bought a jukebox, had it stocked with only Hank Williams records, and then had it delivered to the Last Frontier with his compliments. "This one's got some good records on it," he said. Arrogance like that didn't win him any friends backstage among the, is the word cognoscenti? The establishment, let's say, at the Grand Ole Opry, the more traditional entertainers. you know, things he would do, like telling some woman that he'd sure like to get into her pants, and her response being, "You can't. I already got one asshole in there." That's got him. But they're sharing like all their favorite sort of comebacks people used, and insults, or his various, I don't know, most memorable moments where he stepped out of line with them, and basically breathing a sigh of relief that he wouldn't be around for a while. None of these people are going to be, reaching out to him to support him or try to bring him back into the good graces of the Opry. He was a big disruption, and I assume they thought, like, okay, well, that's over. He'll go somewhere else, or he'll stop putting out records, or he'll probably not be very successful after this because he's got a bad reputation with the Grand Ole Opry. That's going to be the beginning and the end of it, right? For a country singer. So we're getting to the jail thing, I promise. So where is he going for support? He goes back home to Montgomery to his mama, and he goes back to his mom's boarding house at 318 North McDonald. And Lily pulls down the shades so that the sunlight won't disturb him, and he basically goes to sleep for a few days. Or stays in his room for a few days and nobody sees him. Lily says he's fallen down, hit his head, and developed blood poisoning, which was her way of explaining the doctor's visits and pharmacy deliveries to the front door of the boarding house, because the neighbors are accustomed to seeing such comings and goings, and they're very well aware of Hank's problems. They've seen ambulances come get him and take him to St. Jude's Hospital, and they'd seen police cars come get him when Lily got furious and decided to let him dry out in jail instead of in the hospital or in her boarding house. So August 17th, around this time, he sneaks out of the house to meet a girl at the Russell Hotel in Alexander City. The police station get a call later that night about trouble at the hotel. The chief, Winfred Patterson, drives over to take care of it himself. He finds Hank Williams, shirtless, but with his white hat on, running up and down the hall screaming that somebody was whipping old ladies and he wanted to find them and make them stop it. The girl he had snuck out with was nowhere to be seen. Patterson gets Hank all calmed down as he can, takes him off to jail, locks him up. All he said to Patterson was, "I've been in better jails than this. I've been in worse jails than this." The girl shows up the next morning, pays his fine, peeling bills off of a wad that would choke a horse. It was so big, onlookers said. Story around town was Hank had thrown all his furniture out the window of the hotel, and that when he was locked up, he said, "How much is the damn town worth anyway? I'll buy it and tear it down and turn it into a damn pea patch." Keith Moon would be proud. So let me also reference, that's from Chet Flippo. Let me also reference AlexCityOutlook.com. News, August 17, 1952, the night Hank Williams was locked up in the Alex City jail. Hank Williams will always be one of Alabama's favorite native sons. His music created a legacy that is still treasured today. His death at the age of 29, blah, 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 blah. But just 4.5 months before Hank's passing, Alexander City got a glimpse of the downward spiral brought on by alcoholism and prescription drug abuse that began as Williams struggled to cope with years of back pain. Blah, blah, blah. The original citation was unearthed several years ago as Alexander City Police Department was going through old files. The citation has been duplicated and now hangs in the office of Deputy Chief Jay Turner, along with the now famous photo of a bare-chested Williams standing outside of his Alexander City jail cell. The charges were public drunkenness and disorderly conduct. Paperwork shows an 11:25 arrest time p.m. The 6'1", 150-pound Williams had been at the Old Russell Hotel, which is near where Piggly Wiggly sits today, and was making a fuss after a day of traveling, drinking, etc., according to historical accounts. I believe he was more or less having DTs. Chief Winifred Patterson was quoted in saying, Hank Williams, the biography by Colin Escott. He was running up and down the hall. Yep, we got that part. After a few hours, reports indicate Darwin Dobbs, who had been hosting Williams and some friends at his Lake Martin Lodge, posted a $25 bond and paid the $10 fine, and Williams was on his way. Before he became ill, he was a regular visitor to the area. Yada, yada, yada. Alabama is my home and always will be, Hank Williams said. We are kind of partial to the people in Alabama and the good people there in Alexander City. We get back to Montgomery every 2 or 3 months and visit my mama. It is sure good to get back home. I'd like to thank everybody in Alexander City for supporting us and buying our records. That was in an interview broadcast in 1950. Now, when you look at the police report, handwritten in pencil on a card, like it was just sort of a standard, processing document. There's a red ink stamp on here. It says forfeiture against the defendant and bail cash bond of, and then there's a $sign and a blank space, and in ink or lead pencil is written $25. R.H. Cook, recorder, below it. And then there's like name, Hiram Hank Williams. This is all written in pencil in the form. Address, Franklin Road, Nashville, Tennessee. Sex, M. Age, 9/17/23. So his birthday instead of his age. Weight, 150. Height, 6'1". Color, W. White. Date of arrest, 8/17/52. Place, Russell Hotel. Time, 11:25 p.m. And then below that, it says like Young Cromer. It looks like Cromer. Now, next to that, there's the section that says charge. And then there's there's 2 lists, each with a blank, like a bubble, like you're taking a multiple choice test next to it. Here they are. Only 2 of them are checkmarked, by the way, disorderly conduct and public drunkenness. So those are the only things he's being processed for. But if you were working in the jailhouse, or if you were arrested and taken to the jailhouse, these are what's on the menu for the record keeping here. Rape, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, this is in order, robbery, burglary, grand larceny, petty larceny, VPL, DWI, reckless driving, speeding, illegal parking, hit-and-run driving, public drunkenness, vagrancy, running red light, disorderly conduct, gaming, so like playing dice out in the streets maybe, or maybe playing dice indoors without a permit or a license. I don't know what the laws were there. Carrying concealed weapons, affray, which is public brawling in a way that causes disruption to the public. Had to look that one up. Assault and battery, doing business without license. I mean, you could get anybody on that if you felt like it. If you just felt like railroading somebody, I'm sure you could just, I don't know, take them in and say they were selling things or trading things or providing services without a license, I guess. Illegal tampering with electric and water meters. Like I get the, I don't know. I would get it if it was like parking meters, but is it so common that people are fucking with their electric meter or water meter? Someone please call in and tell me. Illegal discharging firearms within city limits and fireworks. These couple are kind of muddled up because that red ink stamp is over the top of them. Like unlawfully something on sidewalk and something within city limits. I think it's like kind of like a vagrancy thing, like sitting around on the sidewalk or blocking it. Unlawfully something handling livestock within city limits. One that just says for investigation. So they bring you in because they can't have you in the street, but they don't have the official charge yet. Driving without license or running a stop sign. That shows up after running a red light, but I guess, I don't know. Yeah. Aren't you glad you know all that now? Hell yeah, you are. Okay, they're in a recording session for the song Cold, Cold Heart with a full band, and I noticed audio dropping out for a half a second here. In the way that it used to when I was a young fellow and a cinematographic film along the lines of Red Dawn would be playing on a local affiliate station. And if they didn't have a pre-recorded track of replacement words, like when they'd show Predator, instead of the word bullshit, Arnold Schwarzenegger would say, baloney. In Red Dawn, I remember the words shit disappearing as if someone had pulled the fader down entirely. Audio just drops out, like the sound of the ambient sound of people running and the explosions and stuff just goes away. I've down to the bunker. Things like that is what you would hear. Now, that's what I think I'm hearing here, and I heard it for a second, rewound it. I may prove myself wrong on second listen, but let's check.
All right, stand by. Cold, cold heart, take one.
Not so loud, but then brushes, shorty.
Okay, that wasn't the noise gate on... Ooh, pardon me. Sorry. I'm talking so close to the mic, bumped my little headphones because I have this turned around towards the speakers for my system. Let me turn the mic back around to myself. Okay, so I don't have to sit so close on the side. Now, all right, I can lean back. That was a definite dropout of audio. So at some point, audio was censored, possibly for television audiences, and not restored for the Warner Archive edition. Not restored for release on maybe VHS tape, for all I know. Maybe not restored for release on laser disc. What do we think Hank said there about the brushes? Because he's referring to he's talking to his drummer, referring to the attack on the snare. That, you know, how hard you're playing the snare drum with those brushes. I think it was probably something similar to a line from The Exorcist. I think he might have said, you know, go easy on those cunting brushes. Now let's talk about what kind of a subject Hank was when it came to being interviewed. I found a book called Hank Williams, A Biobibliography from 1983 by George William Kuhn. And I just kind of opened it to a random page. It just happened to be beginning of chapter 3. It said interviews. So, all right, good place to start. I'm down with this. And he talks about, you know, how Hank was content to just promote his records with some sort of down-home generalizations, but he was pretty insecure. He didn't come out from behind his sort of public face or facade to make the media's life any easier. He didn't really like talking about his personal life to strangers like that, and he didn't really have elaborate theories about his skills or insight into what it was like to be Hank Williams as a writer and performer. He didn't have advice for people really that he wanted to, you know, throw out there on the radio necessarily. And he didn't feel particularly like his upbringing was anything to, I don't know, to anybody else. You know, it wasn't like it wasn't like a lot of people that they want to tell you all about where they grew up and their parents and what made them who they are, you know, what happened to them as a child. I mean, you hear it all the time. People, not even famous people being interviewed anymore, people on their own podcasts or people on their own YouTube channels, they'll just sort of go on and on as if it's somehow significant that they grew up watching Nickelodeon cartoons and TV shows in the 90s. Like, yes, like almost everyone in your country and your generation. Like, oh, it had a big impact on me when I heard Blink-182 on the radio. Yeah, everyone in your high school class that liked rock music with guitars got into pop punk. We get it. You're in a pop punk band. We could do the fucking math, dude. Sorry, I hate Blink-182. That just came to mind. I just remember I worked with a young kid at a guitar shop who was in, you know, he was oh boy, one of those Christian musicians. I'm sorry, Christian musicians. Most of you that play in church are not that interesting. Christian music that I love, Hank Williams, case in point. There. Hank Williams and, you know, gospel field haulers from back in the day, people that I kind of believe when they're singing about wanting to be delivered by Jesus. I actually, find a recording of Steal Away to Jesus from way back in the early 20th century, if you can. It'll kill you. Anyway, back to being interviewed. He was drinking a lot, Hank. That didn't always leave him in the greatest shape for like getting up in the morning and going to promote on the radio, maybe even in the afternoon. So he would, say things like, oh, his favorite record that he's ever done is Cold, Cold Heart. His favorite food is chicken. His favorite color is blue. His favorite entertainers are Johnny Ray and Moon Mullican, and that he did have a record collection. Jerry Rivers reports that California disc jockey Cottonseed Clark asked Hank why his songs were so sad. Hank replied, well, Cottonseed, I guess I always have been a sadist. Saddest. I don't know if that was supposed to be a pun, or he's saying, I'm a sadistic person. I want to make other people sad. When Alan Rankin asked him about a Luke the Drifter number, so Luke the Drifter, if I haven't covered it in this before this chunk of what you're hearing in the podcast, is his sort of moralizing poet alter ego that sort of warns the average listener against the kind of, behavior that Hank Williams engaged in all the time. But it's a lot of sort of, think about this before you do that, and maybe you better get right with God before you go haul off and sock somebody in the face, or take a bunch of pills and drink a bunch of booze and other things that I did yesterday as Hank Williams, not as Luke the Drifter. But the Hank replies to the question, some question about why he wrote a certain Hank the Drifter song the way he did. Don't know why I happen to have wrote that thing, except somebody that's fell. He's the same man, ain't he, as before he fell? Got the same blood in his veins, ain't he? So how can he be such a nice guy when he's got nothing? Can you tell me? There was an interview with Rufus Jarman not long before Hank's death, where there were some good quotes, like when he was emphasizing the sincerity of the good country singer, and said that when a hillbilly sings a crazy song, he feels crazy. When he sings, I laid my mother away, he sees her laying right there in the coffin. The reason for the sincerity is that the hillbilly singer was brought up in tough circumstances. He knew about life, about hard work. In Hank's words, you've got to have smelt a lot of mule manure before you can sing like a hillbilly. The people who've been raised something like the way the hillbilly has knows what he is singing about and appreciates it. His songs, he added, are for the common people, American or otherwise, and he argued that the music revealed quite a bit about American life. There is a interview printed next with Bob McKinnon, a disc jockey for WRFS in Alexander City, Alabama, going back to Alexander City. And he was on daily shows like the Cowbell Club and the 1050 Club and Bob's Ballroom. He was a friend of the Williams family, and at the request of Lily Williams, he took Hank to Lake Martin for recuperation in the middle of August 1952, a week after the firing from the Grand Ole Opry that we just referenced with that trip to jail. Let's see. He had Hank and his wife Audrey on. Let's see. And it says that this text is actually from 2 years previous to that little recuperation in August of 52. This is in 1950. So Bob McKinnon, Audrey Williams, Hank Williams. I will try to do my best to just differentiate their voices for you so I don't have to read their name before every line. But Bob starts, it's mighty fine to have all these best-selling records, but this morning, man, we've got something better than that. We have the man himself, Hank Williams. Hank, how are you? Obviously, I know this is not what a gentleman from, Alabama sounds like in 1952. I'm not going to put on it. I'm not putting on any insulting accents this time. Not that I haven't done so in the past, just not for a sustained amount of time. And I got nothing against Southern people or their accents. I love the sound, and that's why I'm not going to try to do it. We have the man himself, Hank Williams. Hank, how are you? Ah, fine, Bob. It's awfully good to see you again, fella. It's mighty good to see you. The world's being nice to you, I suppose. All just fine. How's everybody in Alex City getting along? They're doing fine, Hank. The way your records are selling all over the country, and the way that Billboard and all these magazines write you up, I can say that you're doing okay. Well, we're eating about 3 times a day, I reckon. Who's this really attractive young lady you have here with you? That's my war department. That's my boss there. That's Mrs. Hank. Can't we get her to say a few words? She'd be glad to. Might I ask you first, Mrs. Hank, how did he ever get such an attractive wife? May I say that, or would that be the wrong thing to say? I'll tell you, we just won't go into that. Thanks anyway. Certainly is nice to have you on our program, too. I understand that some time ago you did some numbers with Hank. Is that right? Yes, that's right. We did a couple, I believe, for MGM. Well, that's fine. Certainly is a pleasure to have you, both of you folks here. Hank, what's up for the future? So this is compared to the stories we know from the film, the modern film, I Saw the Light, which we'll get into eventually. And the biographies, Audrey really wanted more attention for her work with Hank, even though most people didn't think she could sing very well at all. So this sounds like a bit of a work, if you don't mind my saying so. A bit of a planted sort of conversation of like, oh, shucks, don't worry about me and that little thing I did with Hank for MGM that maybe you should go check out. I'm too modest to talk about it. Whatever. It certainly is a pleasure to have both of you folks here. Hank, what's up for the future? What's up? I didn't realize in 1950 people were saying what's up on White Radio. What records have you got coming out? What can you tell us about the future? Well, you got this new one called Long Gone Lonesome Blues. I reckon I have, boy. Spinning it every day. Well, that's fine. I don't know what's coming up next. They don't tell me. Everybody else finds out before I do. By the way, Audrey's going to make some records here a little later. They talking to her about recording. She's going to record for Decca. You ought to have some of them on before long. Sure do. I'm going to look for them, Hank. I don't have any of them now, but they haven't made them yet. Maybe that's why I haven't got any. That's possible. How was this overseas trip you took there a while back? That was a fine deal. We went to, where did we go, honey? We went to Berlin, we went to Vienna, we went to Wiesbaden. Hank is very careful with the pronunciation, which brings a good bit of laughter. Maybe he says Wiesbaden or Wiesbaden or something. We strictly went to Wiesbaden. I don't even know if that's the right pronunciation. My apologies to the two German listeners in Germany right now and the one in Leavenworth, Washington. We went all over the occupied zone over there, where we had any boys at all. We went to see him. I guess he means audience. Any boys. And by the way, on the 19th, me and the boys are going to Alaska and see all the boys up there. Gonna go pick them a few tunes, that is, if we can get thawed out enough. Well, Hank, that's mighty fine. I tell you, there is another thing, too. I'd like to ask you right now, how's that young fella Randall Hank getting along? You mean Bocephus, huh? Bocephus, is that what it is? Yeah, I got to call him that when he was his first... Yeah, I got to calling him that when he was his firstborn. Use take 2. And he's got to where he won't answer to nothing else. So, Hank Williams, it's been nice being with you once again. I'd like to tell you that I still think you're number one in friendliness and the number one hillbilly artist today. It's a pleasure to play your records because you're such a nice guy and because your records are so good. Anything you'd like to tell the good folks in Alabama? Yeah, that's awful kind of you, Bob. You know, Alabama's my home. Well, it's both our homes. Me and my wife both come from Alabama. And we're sort of partial to the folks in Alabama. In fact, we're always talking about Alabama everywhere we go. I get back down to Montgomery about, say, every 2 or 3 months to see my mother. She lives down there. My wife's people live down below Troy, Alabama. We go down quite often. We stay in pretty close contact with Alabama. I'd like to say thanks to everybody for requesting these tunes. And we really appreciate it. And every time you buy one of these records, remember that it's not that I need the money so bad, but the folks I owe need it awfully bad. Thank you, Hank Williams and Mrs. Hank. Mighty glad to have you with us today. And we'll be looking for those records you're going to make. That's some good stuff. Nice one, Hank. So a quick note on Bocephus. That was the stage name for a guy named Rodney Leon Brosfield, who died in 1958, born in 1910. He was a comedian on the Grand Ole Opry from 1947 till his death. He got inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1987. He was in a double act in 48 with Minnie Pearl, playing what she referred to as double comedy, in which each of them delivered alternating punchlines and neither played the straight man. Some of these routines were broadcast on the Opry's live ABC television network show from 1955 to 56. Let's see. He sometimes did ventriloquist routines with a dummy, there it is, named Bocephus, after whom Hank Sr. nicknamed his then infant son, Hank Williams Jr. Also, he did some comedy bits with June Carter at one point. He appeared with Elvis Presley at Atlanta's Fox Theater. Then he was in a movie called A Face in the Crowd. He played Andy Griffith's ex-con sidekick and appeared in Country Music Holiday 1958. His ex-con sidekick. I don't recall who, if that was is that the entry doesn't specify if that's like the Andy Griffith Show television program or some live performance of some comedy routine. But maybe television historians listening right now could call in and let me know. Please do. We're taking a break. There's a cool piano in a honky tonk down in Mexico. He wears a purple sash and a black mustache in a honky tonk down in Mexico. This is intermission time for your Cheatin' Heart. Okay, now we're further on in the movie. We're getting towards what's the opposite of a peak? The lowest point. And mansions and babies born. Hank Williams Jr. Bocephus is in the world, and there's a back injury from falling off a horse because he's so happy. And there's more dates, but in the South, there's no traveling very far, really. I mean, for those times, I get it. You know, the late 1940s, early 1950s. It's a ways to go, but still. Then there's a confrontation with his wife, Audrey, where she says, "Where is it written?" Or I may be misquoting. Who said? I think it was who said. Who said it's a sin to be rich and famous? I believe the source of that might be the New Testament of the Bible, with a whole metaphor about the eye of a needle and a camel and a rich person getting into heaven. But they've portrayed her as someone who's ambitious and not bad at what she does, and him as someone that's been dragging his feet the entire time. I don't really know what the movie's trying to tell me about their relationship so much, because it keeps telling me that I'm supposed to fill in a lot of the blanks myself. It doesn't visually give you a ton of history as far as his career and playing and singing songs and what the reactions were. I think it reminds me of how much slightly better a movie like Walk the Line did this in the early 2000s. But a lot of 80s movies tried to do, and they probably did a little bit better. So I think the musical aspect of this, we're coming from a stage play mentality about the construction of this story and how we present it to you visually. Idea probably relies a lot on the audience knowing exactly what happened with Hank Williams' life. Watching it, in the 2022 era, I don't really know. So now I got to go read some books and watch some more movies. Now, more context for hillbilly music as it was being viewed in America, the era predating Hank Williams' rise to fame. Talking 1938, Collier's magazine. If you're like me, the only mention of Collier's you've ever had in your consciousness came from jokes on The Simpsons via Mr. Burns. But it was a big deal back in the day, and it was published, I believe, in New York. And there's a definite New York snobbery that you'll notice in this narrative. Thar's Gold in Them Hillbillies by Kyle Crichton. Collier's April 30th, 1938, pages 26 and 27. For those that don't know, Thar's Gold in Them Thar Hills is a sort of old catchphrase about the westward expansion and the search for gold in the hills and mountains, I believe, of California, up the West Coast, also up into Alaska, as I learned as a child. Probably not in school, but from Bugs Bunny cartoons. All right. The young man with the Adam's apple seemed out of place in a New York elevator. Very definitely, he was not a New Yorker. And in addition, he was not welcome in the crowded car because he carried under his arm a case that looked like a rough box for a horse. We are 2 sentences in, and a rough box for a horse as a guitar case for someone that maybe couldn't afford, I guess, a posh guitar case from the Sears Montgomery Ward catalog. I don't know what that shitty attitude's about. But just like, I was in an elevator in a New York building with someone that didn't belong. And then there's a phonetic quote written. Well, y'all pardon me, he said plaintively. I'm having some trouble with this here guitar. He carried the trouble with him when he got off at the 11th floor. So we're indicating the narrator clearly is annoyed that he's in a crowded elevator with someone holding a guitar case. Probably a normal guitar case. Probably not even, I don't know, a wooden one. Maybe it is. Who knows? But for crying out loud, it's just so derisive. But he acts like he just hammered together a bunch of pine boards to carry his guitar in without really explaining what it looked like or what its composition was. I'm so cranky about this. And the fact that his guitar is trouble because it inconvenienced people in the elevator. Heavens to Betsy. Anyways, he walks into a room before a microphone having an audition for phonograph records. He said with some hesitation that he would do imitations of Jimmy Rogers and started in a thin wailing voice to do Blue Yodel No. 1, which has for its theme T for Texas, T for Tennessee, and T for Thelma. It seemed that Thelma had made a bum out of somebody and was to receive a bullet from a 44 through her middle, quote, just for to see her jump and fall. This was the rare thing of a New York edition for hillbilly songs and race records. The general practice is to take a recording outfit into the territory where such songs grow. And out of this endeavor have come such classics as The Wreck of Old 97, Floyd Collins in the Cave, Little Log Cabin in the Lane, The Old Hen Cackles, and The Rooster's Going to Crow, Crazy Blues, Jimmy Rogers and his Blue Yodels, numbers 1 through 12. Let me pause. Just to get into the Blue Yodel number 1, T for Texas, Jimmy Rogers lyrics. T for Texas, T for Tennessee, T for Thelma, the gal that made a wreck out of me. I'm not going to do the yodeling parts. If you don't want me, mama, you sure don't have to stall, because I can get more women than a passenger train can haul. Gonna buy me a pistol just as long as I'm tall. Gonna shoot poor Thelma just to see her jump and fall. Going where the water drinks like cherry wine. Sing 'em, boys, sing 'em. Lord, I'm going where the water drinks like cherry wine, because this Georgia water tastes like turpentine. Gonna buy me a shotgun with a great long shiny barrel. Gonna shoot that rounder that stole away my gal. Obviously, I'm usually skipping the repeated lines. And the yodels, some more yodels. Rather drink muddy water, sleep in a hollow log, than to be in Atlanta, treated like a dirty dog. Great lyrics. A lot that influenced what came before it. Water that tastes like wine. I think we've heard that a kabillion times probably. Also, the most modern reinterpretation of some of this sentiment, I would say, is Johnny Cash's Delia's Gone. For a lot of us rock douchebags in the 90s, that was the first country music we could really be, I guess, impressed by. Like it wasn't slick. It wasn't slick 90s produced pop country. And you knew Johnny Cash was a legend. You just didn't really, if you were me at that age, you just didn't have the, awareness of all the things he had done. And just to hear, I guess for me, it was at the same time I was getting into Robert Johnson. So just to hear someone being so blatantly mean-spirited was great. And violent without describing themselves as a badass. I think that's what it was. I think like what was going on in hip hop at the time. I'm talking late 90s. What was going on in heavy music at the time, commercial heavy music. There was so much in both genres that were getting mainstream about how tough and badass the singer was. But it was much more affecting as a person in your late teens to just hear blatantly that, yeah, I shot my lover, and I shot her just to see what would happen. There's more than one Johnny Cash song about that, whether it's a lover or a man in Reno. But I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could be so simple about it and so direct about it, and not try to create any sympathy for the narrator of your song when you do that. Back to the article. Thing Called Love, the song titles. Just Because, Deep Elam Blues, Prisoner's Song, Coming Around the Mountain, Hand Me Down, A Walking Cane, Casey Jones, 21 Years, and hundreds of others. So the narrator, author is, just letting you know that what record or phonograph duplication companies or recording companies are doing is usually going out into other parts of the country besides New York to record artists doing their thing. But now they're coming to New York into, highfalutin buildings south of a point that might roughly be regarded as St. Albans, West Virginia. The grapevine system of news distribution still beats anything known to modern science. A hint from New York that David Kapp of Decca or Eli Oberstein of Victor is headed south will find the tidings flying over mountains, and the result will be that when the city slickers arrive, they will be unable to get into their hotels for the presence of mouth organ virtuosos, yodelers, blues singers, and specialty bands equipped with instruments made up of tissue paper on combs, washboards, assorted saws, and rutabaga gourds. If there needs to be another picture at this point, the camera can leap agilely to such distant parts of South Africa and Australia, where the native bushmen are busily humming a little number written by Jimmy Davis of Shreveport, Louisiana, and entitled Nobody's Darling But Mine. In short, no matter what the citizens of the United States think about their native songs, the world ranks the hillbilly ballads among the folk tune wonders of the universe. It started back in 1921 when Ralph S. Peer was with OK Records. Sophie Tucker had agreed to do You Can't Keep a Good Man Down, but it was found at the last moment that another contract prevented her from working for OK. This is OK Records spelled O-K-E-H, as was the style at the time. Heavily featured in the appendices of Nick Toshi's Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll, OK Records. He's got lists of all the earliest rock and roll recordings ever. In this crisis, Perry Bradford, who was a colored song plugger for W.C. Handy, St. Louis Blues, Memphis Blues, etc., informed Mr. Peer, and song plugger, as I've covered in, I believe, another episode, but I wouldn't expect you to know it or remember it here, as someone paid by a song publishing company to go into bars and various juke joints or whatever where people are gathering, where there's a live band or there's a jukebox, and plug songs, like request songs from the live house band or singer, and or play them on the jukebox, and then talk about how great they are really loudly so everyone pays attention and hopefully goes and buys sheet music of that song. Let's see. Who could furnish a girl? Yeah, here we go. Inform Mr. Peer he could furnish a girl who was as good as Sophie. She turned out to be Mamie Smith, a colored girl who was working as cleaning woman in a theater. She made the Good Man song, and for the other side of the record, did That Thing Called Love. This is 1938. There's been like a million songs since then with that exact same phrase in the title, or a variation of the phrase, The Thing Called Love. Call back to, I think, 2001 or whatever that song came out. Mamie had a loud, raucous voice, and there was great difficulty with recordings in that day of poor equipment. But the OK people knew they had something when the record sold 75,000 copies in the first month. Mamie was forthwith yanked back into the studio, and this time she brought with her a horrendous five-piece band known as Mamie Smith's Jazz Hounds. They made Crazy Blues and It's Right Here for You. Next subheadline is A Market Nobody Thought of. Burt Willis, the colored comedian, had been making records for Columbia for many years, but the companies never imagined that Negroes themselves might be a market for Negro records. In fact, the companies carefully hid the fact that a colored singer was being used. About this time, dealers in New York began to report a curious trend in the business. It seemed that Negro Pullman porters on trains going south invariably left New York with as many as $25 apiece under their arms. Since the records cost $1 each, the business was big stuff, and Mr. Peer went south to investigate. He found A, that the Negroes were buying records of their own people in great quantities, and that B, that the Negroes of Richmond, Virginia, invariably referred to themselves as the race. So, pausing for a second, if you're here as just a hardcore country fan, you're like, why the hell is the person on this podcast about to start talking about race records? And why are we not talking about Hank Williams, goddammit? Just because I want to set up where the industry was at before Hank made his rise to stardom and fame, and before his record started making such a big impact. The industry was forced to sort of grow and adapt as their own audiences became, more prevalent, and they had to keep them separated. And they had to create like marketing terms, what we would call demographics now, to keep them, on their own airwaves, their own radio stations, and start marketing the records to different audiences. Of course, this will all change as time goes on, and younger generations don't give a shit about the color line, and, rock and roll mutates and and begins its ascendancy. This is, after all, a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. If I don't tie this in to the bigger picture, then what am I doing? Now, quote, we've all had records by foreign groups, said Mr. Peer, German records, Swedish records, Polish records, but we were afraid to advertise Negro records. So I listed them in the catalog as race records, and they are still known for that. I'm going to take a second and do a quick screenshot of that little bit. Let's see. Got it. All right. About this time, the vogue of Mamie Smith at OK was swamped by the arrival of the great Bessie Smith on Columbia Records. Quite a powerhouse. If you haven't listened, check her out. Bessie Smith has now become almost a legendary figure, and her records have lately been reissued in a new form and are considered classics in blues singing by the experts. Her most famous was at Gold Coast Blues, which originally sold into the millions. I think my personal favorite is Spider-Man Blues, but that's because Spider-Man's my favorite superhero. Clearly, it had nothing to do with Marvel Comics, but still a good performance. It may be remarked that at present day, a sale of 100,000 records is held to be sensational in any field. With Bessie Smith being so successful, OK was under the necessity of digging up a new sensation. And Mr. Peer took a portable recording outfit to Atlanta and began looking around. For some reason, Atlanta is the worst town in the South for Negro talent, then and now. Yeesh. Motherfucker. And Mr. Peer was soon stumped. At the suggestion of a local dealer who guaranteed to sell enough records to cover the cost, he did a few recordings by fiddler John Carson, a white mountaineer, who arrived for the recordings in overalls. So you see where I'm going? These two different genres, happen in the same time, in the same places. Old John had been a ballyhoo man with a circus, had a repertoire of hillbilly songs that never ended, and he could sing a bit with his fiddling. He made Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane and The Old Hen Cackles and The Rooster's Goin' to Crow. Ballyhoo is sort of a fellow that is like a promoter. He's like a carnival barker, maybe outside the carnival. There's a lot of references I can find to it being like shitty, but also loud, a big ruckus, public excitement. So I'll just assume that that's a noisy, was it? Oh, here we go. Merriam-Webster, noisy, attention-getting demonstration or talk, flamboyant, exaggerated, or sensational promotion or publicity, and excited commotion. There we go. It was so bad we didn't even put a serial number on the records, thinking that when the local dealer got his supply, that would be the end of it, said Mr. Peer. We sent him 1,000 records, which he received on a Thursday. That night, he called New York on the phone and ordered 5,000 more, sent by express, and 10,000 by freight. When the national sale got to 500,000, we were so ashamed we had Fiddler John come up to New York and do a re-recording of the numbers. The matter of the name arose again in this connection. It was obviously impossible to list them under the designation of each section, Mountaineer, Georgia Cracker, etc. And Mr. Peer, who had come from Kansas City and was well acquainted with the Ozarks, named them Hillbilly Records. The result is that the word has come to have a general application, and mountaineers of all sections are now known as hillbillies. The greatest success of all time was made by Prisoner's Song, which was introduced almost as an afterthought by Vernon Dalhart, who had done The Wreck of Old 97 and was desperate for something the other side of the record. It eventually sold 2,500,000 records for the Victor Company. It cost the company 7 cents to make the record, all expenses included, and the wholesale price they received was 37 cents a record. Jesus Christ! The next subtitle is The Singing Brakeman. So we're going more into country again. The greatest of all romances in the hillbilly business centers about Jimmy Rogers, the little railroad brakeman who fought desperately against poverty and the ravages of tuberculosis until Mr. Peer discovered him in Bristol, Tennessee, and started him on a career that was fabulous even in the phonograph industry. Wow, that is a long sentence. I'm never gonna hate myself for using that many commas again. It's estimated that the Blue Yodel records sold over 5 million copies. Jimmy Rogers is now dead, and his records do not have the fame with collectors that has come to those of Bessie Smith, but he has left a mark on all hillbilly music. And that would be a bigger mark as time went on. Again, I think I can safely point to the Ken Burns country music documentary if you want, I think, more than one entire episode that does pretty good justice to his its effect on American music, American life, and hillbilly and country music as well. When David Kapp goes out to Dallas now for Decca to record hillbilly and race records, he will do as many as 325 selections in 15 days. The big stars now are Jimmy Davis, clerk of the criminal court in Shreveport, Louisiana, and Gene Autry. Another one, if you want to understand, yep. If you don't have a book handy, go watch the Ken Burns documentary. Canopy with a K.com if you have a public library account in some parts of the United States. You can watch it for free. Let's see. Gene Autry, the singing cowboy of the movies. Another favorite group is the Carter family of Mesa Springs, Virginia, who sing and play and make marvelous didos with such instruments as the guitar and auto harp, which is really a zither with keys. The best colored singer since Bessie Smith is said to be Georgia White, and it is in this field that some of the most remarkable records are made. There are colored numbers so strictly African and special, nobody but a Negro could understand them or appreciate them. Let's pause. Let's pause there. Take a break. Get back to some of me yammering about a movie I'm watching. We're getting towards the end now. I mean, if the music is any indication, I think it's Shorty that's giving him the rundown of what's happening back at the mansion, because his wife's left him and took the kids. He's like, we all saw this coming. I don't want to be an I told you so, but back and forth across the country, running all over the place. Like, wait. This movie has not shown us a single instance of them going back and forth across the country. He's been with the same band for most of this film, and they have never gotten out of the Southeast United States. Everything this movie does is a stage play that is blown up a little bit for a musical black and white film, and it's, I think, visually very effective, but they don't give you any indication of the breadth and depth of Hank Williams's success or fame or influence or what's going on, except for one tiny little half a montage of crowds going crazy for him, for the celebrity that he is put off by and, disenchanted by. It is a very lopsided, weird kind of movie. But I'm curious if this is a film that sets the precedent for a lot of American entertainment films with the rise to the top and the sudden crash, because it has a lot of the hallmarks that I see in other films I've already reviewed and already watched a bunch of times. I think the DNA of this film is in a lot of the other films from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s that I've watched. Maybe it draws on something else. Maybe it draws on other tales of fame and fortune that come crashing down. But cinematically, I'm seeing a lot of things that resonate with me as a person who grew up as a child in the 80s and watched La Bamba and, watched... a ton of films. Okay, I'm blanking now because I'm rambling. But I watched a ton of films later on VHS and later on DVD after the 80s that were about figures from the 60s and the 70s and the 50s. I don't know. I'm getting suspicious. This might be a game changer of a movie, even though it disappoints me a whole lot. Back to the Gold in Them Hillbillies article from Collier's Magazine. Ba-doop. Let's see. The singing brakeman section. Let's see. It is... when Sleepy John Estes does his own Negro compositions, they seem to be in another language. The melodies are strange. The words are like something out of a voodoo chant. And the manner of delivery is such that they make no sense whatever to the untrained white mind. The recordings by P.D. Wheatstraw come in the same class. We've covered him, I believe, in the Robert Johnson episode. Episode P.D. Wheatstraw, Devil's Son-in-Law. Sorry, nope, not the same guy. Not the guy from the movies in the 70s. Let's see. But a legend. A legend that this blues singer sort of drew upon to create his own persona that would definitely have to have been... I'm not going to go back and review my own podcast to verify this, but I think that was definitely an influence on Screamin' Jay Hawkins. And if you don't know Screamin' Jay Hawkins yet, you probably heard a song by him called I Put a Spell on You, whether it was his version or the Creedence Clearwater Revival version or the Marilyn Manson version. But also, if you're going to revisit that or visit it for the first time, check out Little Demon as well. It's a real treat. Let's see, Petey Wheatstraw come in the same class, and when Kokomo Arnold does the Sebastopol on his guitar, effects are made that seem unearthly. So, if you're familiar with the term othering, this is othering. An entire race of musicians. I'm assuming that because the author is not making any strides to say, now, not all the Negroes are this way, just the musicians down there in this particular part of the country. It's shitty either way, but I would be curious to know what was on the writer's mind. It was like, these black people, their music, it's crazy, it's alien, it's ghostly. That's how they are. Or if it was just like, no, it's just sort of a racket to scare white people. I'm really, really genuinely curious as to what the writer was thinking about, like what they were trying to convey. Obviously, they weren't trying to convey a whole lot of detail as far as I don't know, opening the minds of the reader. Mostly just that little impression, that little fearful impression here. Unless the artist is also the writer of his own material and hence shares in the royalty for the composers, the rewards of recording are not great, being on an average of $25 a side of a record, that is, folks, that didn't have records when they grew up. The payment is outright and there is no bookkeeping. So what he's saying is, look, you get paid for a session and then you go away, and then the record company makes all the money from the sales, which was true for a long time after that. But there were at least contracts, and there was at least royalties and things. There was different permutations of that kind of a deal. But you still had to have a lot of money to sue the company that put out your records, to check their books, make sure the accounting was right, after they started keeping books and accounting. So at this time, you're screwed 5 different ways. Among the novelty records are those made by Calypso people in the West Indies, the Cajuns of Louisiana, and Corny Allen Greer and his band. The loyalty of the hillbilly audience to its heroes can be seen in the titles of the songs. When Jimmy Davis wrote Nobody's Darling But Mine, he immediately made a sequel entitled An Answer to Nobody's Darling. That was followed by A Woman's Answer to Nobody's Darling. Bob and Joe Shelton, who also come from Shreveport, wrote Just Because in collaboration with Leon Chapelier. When it became a success, they followed that with Just Because 3. It's quite possible that the thing could go on forever. Students are convinced that Bessie Smith, and particularly the players who accompanied Bessie Smith on her records, have had a great part in stimulating that disease known as swing music, which has now gripped the nation. Bessie had such men doing her accompaniments as Louis Armstrong, Fletcher Henderson, Joe Smith, Fred Longshaw, Charlie Green, and the late James P. Johnson, one of the most spectacular of the hot pianists. Musicians are the keenest people in the world at admiring new talent, and just as Benny Goodman will sit goggle-eyed now listening to the hottities of Count Basie, the colored demon of Kansas City, so did the orchestra leaders of 10 years ago go insane over the berserk playing of Bessie Smith's Boys. From that interest came the change in orchestra music that is now so pronounced in the work of Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Gray, Jimmy Dorsey, and others. I'm trying hard not to slip into a parody of Tucker Carlson's voice while reading this shit. The traditional folk songs of the Southern mountaineers and the spirituals have not been included in this discussion because they occupy a special position in the art of song. In the strictest sense, the mountaineer ballads are Old English folk songs. Aha! English folk. Distinct. Not this other dirty stuff. Some of them even traceable to old Gregorian chants, and as such, they are not strictly American products. New York was recently visited by the Reverend John William Dawson, pastor of the Dry Folk Primitive Baptist Church of Moorhead, Kentucky, who sang "Lord, Spare Me for Another Year" and "The Wayfaring Stranger." The words seem to have grown out of local legends of the mountains, but the tunes stem back to the earliest days of American history when the first settlers crossed from the Old Country. Most strictly in the American tradition are the songs of Aunt Molly Jackson of Harlan County, Kentucky, who has told the story of the labor struggles of that section. Her songs are richly evocative and thrilling, carrying the troubadour quality of old. Next subtitle, Fans Are Delighted. But it's when Sleepy John Estes on his guitar and Hammy Nicks on his mouth organ get wound up that the newfound fans start yammering with delight. There are... Home stretch, everybody. There are isolated groups in all sections of the world prepared to fight to the death to prove that Maxine Sullivan from the Onyx Club is a greater artist than Lily Pons. Miss Sullivan became the storm center of radio controversy as the first person to swing Loch Lomond and other ballads. There are strange individuals who wouldn't give a Georgia White and Rhubarb Red guitar record for anything made by Caruso. The cult of hillbillies may be a passing fancy, but it is significant that Ambrose, the swankiest orchestra conductor in London, has made an arrangement of Nobody's Darling But Mine. When the St. Louis Blues is made into a metropolitan opera, the truth will finally be evident. In the meanwhile, the nasal-voiced boys and girls of the hinterlands, who have most curious things to say about love and my gal Sal. There seems to be an awful lot of double-crossing done by the ladies in the mountings. I assume that's a phonetic writing of mountains. But if you have the hardcore hillbilly accent, it sounds like mountings to somebody in New York. And they invariably pay for it. This makes art. Yeesh. Now I know why that movie McClintock with John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara, this like young douchebag that played the banjo, was from New York. Was trying to teach all the excited young ladies the hot New York steps that they were doing back east. And I won't even get into John Wayne stuff. Of course, it's there's plenty of reasons to object to John Wayne movies, but it does bring into sharp focus the reason why maybe people from the West would have distaste for this the New York mentality, the New York state of mind, if you will, pre-Billy Joel. Good God. And don't go watch McClintock now with John Wayne and get pissed off at me at how objectionable it is to you. I'm not endorsing it. I've watched it a bunch of times because I read Preacher by Garth Ennis. I regret nothing. Point being, though, if I were in a position to get my hands on a time machine, then if I were a man of less couth and a bearer of insurmountable grudges, I would travel back to 1938, post-haste, challenge Kyle Crichton, that gilded gelding of a knickerbocker, to a right manly duel. But alas, I have no time machine, and alack, for I am no such grudge-bearing man, except to maybe a certain member of my local Seattle scene, who is violently distrustful, let us say, and an emotionally abusive predator that I was asked to help with his guitar equipment once last summer. A very, very popular man of visionary status here in the local Seattle scene these days. And no one listening to this will have any clue what I'm talking about, but that doesn't change the fact that he is and always will be one
lying sack of shit. Hi, John. Fuck you.
Now, I want to take some time in this episode to discuss a little bit about how Hank conducted his group, the Drifting Cowboys, and his mentality when it came to song arrangements or, dynamics. He was clearly very, very conscious of how to kind of compose things in a way. I don't mean compose as in terms of like where the verse goes and the bridge goes and the chorus goes, but I mean how the band should operate. And obviously he had support there from the A-Cuff Rose fellas who were in charge of the recording and distribution and such. But also this same little, chunk of the narrative will touch on the overseas trip they took that was mentioned briefly in the interview I read from earlier from 1950. Within the first 3 months of Hank working with what would sort of be known as the classic era lineup of the Drifting Cowboys, he had kind of schooled them in what he wanted from his band. He hated players that were too busy. And if you're not a musician, that means playing too many notes that don't support what the vocalist is doing generally. Don't do jazz. Don't do fiddly stuff, especially if it's stepping all over the vocal, especially if you're a string player, because the string players occupy the same territory in the human ear as the human voice in lots of cases. So that's why pianos are so wide. They have such a long range, so you can play really low notes when someone's singing high and really high notes when someone's singing lower. There's notes about the fact that, when he wasn't singing, he didn't want a whole lot of, cleverness going on musically, fills, as you call them. He wanted solos to be simple and as direct as his vocals. That also would make them memorable. That mentality was not new at the time, and it's not old in our current era. Obviously, there's lots of pop music of the modern era where a vocalist sings a catchy hook and there has to be instrumental breaks every now and then, but a lot of times those instrumental breaks, on the digital side of things or whatever are kind of mimicking what the vocals have already done to keep that melody in your head. There might be a key change. It might go higher, but it's still kind of mimicking the melody. In a, 30 some years ago example, the guitar solo for Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit is the same notes as the vocal for Smells Like Teen Spirit. Na 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 na. It's the verse. To go back earlier than that, Van Halen's, Jamie's Crying. That's the vocal hook. And Hank was not shy about saying, I know a lot of good guitar players who've educated themselves right out of a job. And he would, in live performances or rehearsals or whatever, he would spin right around during instrumental portions of his songs and glare at a musician that was getting a little too big for his britches. And in old school kind of country guitar circles, Hank Garland is a fairly a legendary figure, although an unsung hero of this kind of transitional era of music. There's even a Hank Garland biopic where Steve Vai, guitar virtuoso Steve Vai, plays Hank Williams in, I think, one scene. And I think like compliments him or whatever backstage at his show. But I guess in real life, Hank Garland comes to town and proves himself the most technically adroit picker in country music, according to the Colin S. Scott biography. And Hank was very dismissive about the effect he was having on everyone around. Oh, he said, he's still searching for it. I've found it. One of Hank's players was Hillous, I can't, Hillous, Buttram, who, whenever he got too fancy for Hank, you know, he would get sort of an admonishment. But Hillous says, apologies to anyone named Hillous, mostly I play 2/4 time. Hank come to me one night and said, Hillous, you play as good a bass as any I've ever heard. At times. Then all of a sudden, you'll take off on that thing, and I don't know what you're doing. He says, when we do Move It On Over, I'd switch to 4/4 on the break. And Hank never understood what I was doing. You wasn't supposed to hear a bass note except over the other one. So I over the other one, meaning what the other guitars were doing, maybe? I'm not totally clear on that. I don't want to misinterpret what he's trying to say, but I like the story. Now, this approach, this simplicity and directness also applied to Hank's phrasing. I don't mean musical phrasing. I mean like verbal phrasing and the way he pronounced words. You know, it got him noticed enough to get him to the Grand Ole Opry, and he wasn't going to like sort of sell out and try to be more sophisticated now that he's got a lot of regular recording sessions going on and try to catch the attention of, you know, the non-hillbilly audience. He was staying true. He was dancing with the girl that he brung, if you will. And, you know, when he sang perhaps, it would sound like prehaps. Picture was pitcher. And if he sang Armageddon in a song like the Battle of Armageddon, it was pronounced ambigotten. Anytime, you know, a producer made suggestions about changing that hillbilly style, or musicians in his band tried changing the hillbilly style, he would just say, vanilla, boys. And by the way, this is the term vanilla. This is before 31 flavors in Baskin Robbins, all right? This is when there was only so many flavors to go around. Vanilla was a perfectly reasonable choice for lots of people, as palates of the time go. I don't have a food scientist handy to back me up on this, but I feel fairly confident. Now, next, let's talk about Europa. So late October 1949, he is heading up to Ontario, Canada. And then after that, he's going in November back to Montgomery for a show with Bill Monroe. Then November 13, he flies to Europe as part of the Prince Albert Opry Review. The Opry troupe, and I'm going to go directly to Colin S. Scott's text here, was to play U.S. Air Force bases on a 2-week tour sponsored by R.J. Reynolds. In Air Force speak, it was deemed a non-revenue mission. According to the protocol of the day, the Russians were informed. Hillbilly music was immensely popular among servicemen overseas. Hillbilly Gasthaus was the highest-rated show on Armed Forces Radio, and the Opry came over at the request of the enlisted men. Hank was issued with a sheet of instructions in Russian, in case he mistakenly wandered into the Russian zone. He looked at the script he was given and said, "Oh, they ain't going to win the next war. They can't even spell." Red Foley led the troupe, backed by Roy Acuff, Jimmy Dickens, Minnie Pearl, and Rod Brasfield. Another Opry act, Radio Dot and Smokey, were cleared by the Department of the Air Force, but don't appear in any photos from the tour. Harry Stone, Jim Denny, and announcer Grant Turner joined the show, and Acuff took his daughter, Thelma, who did a tap dance routine. I don't know who most, if not any of those names are, but for you Grand Ole Opry historians that are listening to this for some reason, even though you know everything, there you go. They were all allowed to bring their spouses because they would be away for Thanksgiving. Acuff and Foley brought their own bands, but Hank was having to work with Foley's band. They left Nashville on what had been General Eisenhower's private plane. They went to Washington, flew on to Newfoundland to refuel. Then they hunkered down their flight across the Atlantic. Hank snuggled next to Audrey, put his coat over them. The next morning, they arrived in Paris, France to refuel, went on to Wiesbaden, Germany, and Oompa Band played Dixie to welcome them. They visited all the base hospitals, playing a few numbers for the patients, put on shows in Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich, and Vienna. The Berlin and Frankfurt shows were recorded for transmission back home on the Prince Albert portion of the Opry. Hank and Red Foley had two of the most popular records of the day, Lovesick Blues and Chattanooga Shoeshine Boy. They were called back for an encore at every hall they played. Hank was straight as an arrow and so careful to avoid alcohol that he sniffed his glass at mealtimes to make sure it contained water, not wine. But that didn't stop him from yelling, "Hey, Herman, bring me the ketchup," anytime he was faced with a dish he didn't recognize. Aside from brief forays into Canada and Mexico, this was Hank's first and last experience of foreign lands. Very similar to Pantera when they went to Europe and decided it was worth it to demand their manager pay to ship in hot sauce from Texas so that they could douse every European dish they ate in the early 90s with it. Pantera episode forthcoming someday. If this wild-looking fellow from Texas ever does complete production or begin production on a proposed film called Cowboys from Hell with a starring role for Joe Don Baker, Mitchell. Mitchell, if you know that film, or if you don't, maybe you know Goldeneye. He was Felix Leiter in that film. You know, just a few years ago, back in 1995 or whatever the dickens it was. If you want a more recent Joe Don Baker reference than 1995, I don't have a lot for you. Point is, if this guy doesn't make Cowboys from Hell, which I don't know, who knows? I'll probably just fudge it and do a episode based on High Plains Drifter, Clint Eastwood, and call it the Cowboys from Hell episode and just talk about Pantera as much as I've always wanted to on this podcast. Let's see. Where was I with the Red Foley and the Oompa Band and the transmission? Again, Oh, yeah. He was staying sober on this trip. When they came back across the Atlantic, plane hits an air pocket, and there's like a huge drop. Everyone's like clutching their seats, but some people that weren't belted in or couldn't hang on to their seats, I guess. I don't even know if they had seat belts in the planes back then. They actually flew up and hit the roof of the plane. And besides that, everyone was coming back home with a bunch of cuckoo clocks that they had bought in Germany in the Black Forest. And those fell out of the overhead racks because they weren't sealed like they are, with a latch now, and smashed on the ground and made cuckoo noises as they hit the floor. They stopped in Bermuda to refuel, and everyone got a bus to the hotel. The roads were very narrow, very windy, and because it was a British colony, oncoming vehicles would suddenly appear on what Hank and the others regarded as the wrong side of the road. So lots of freaking out, even though they were off the plane at that point. On the arrival back to Nashville, Hank bent over gingerly and kissed the tarmac. Now, once he gets back home and finds out, one of his songs, My Bucket's Got a Hole in It, is climbing up the charts. It was going to be number 2 in December. He actually gets a much more strenuous sort of touring itinerary back in America. He is working with a guy named Oscar Davis, who has now dropped all of his other clients so he can just focus on booking Hank, which is going to be an incredibly stressful development. To go back to Colin Escott's text, it says, after successful tours out west through the Southwest and up the Ohio Valley into Canada, Oscar Davis had decided to promote Hank on the eastern seaboard during the period leading up to Christmas. On December 8, Hank was to star for a week at the Hippodrome Theater in Baltimore and was scheduled to follow it with a Potomac River cruise show and headline appearance at the Roosevelt Hotel in Washington. He started drinking in Dayton, Ohio after losing some money in a craps game, and by the time he got to Baltimore, he was drunk. It was the first time the new version of the Drifting Cowboys had seen Hank on a bender. They checked into the hotel behind the Hippodrome with everyone on edge because Hank, although drunk, still thought himself able to perform. The band was watching him closely. But when he needed a drink, Hank was more resourceful than anyone gave him credit for. He bribed a bellhop to bring up whiskey miniatures hidden inside a pitcher of ice and arranged for one of the girls in the square dance troupe to hide miniatures in her skirts for him. The rule of thumb that people came to use with Hank was that it would take about 3 days for him to get good and drunk and then 3 days to get over it. All right, let's finish up this damn movie. All right, announcement of Hank's death to a crowd that was waiting to see him. Again, another instance of this movie telling you things it will not show you. He was connected to you. He was part of you, the audience. He was here for you. You know, the only indication of that is the Audrey character telling him he needs to stop pretending to be poor and be a person that's successful. And then the reaction of other people saying that he was really a salt of the earth person. Good heavens. All right, this is so vulgar in its intent and execution. Not visually, but I mean, gross. We'll talk a little bit about how Hank made money indirectly because of his charisma and his good songs and his entertaining. It's not just royalties. It's not just performance money. He had deals with sponsors like most, country artists of the era did. I seem to find, in my opinion, he seems a little less of a huckster than a lot of other country musicians that sort of lived or died by their pitches, for a ton of different products, like a revolving door. Like he was the dude that, Mother's Best Flower put on the air for a good period of time, and the life insurance company put on the air for a good period of time, of course. And if you want to kind of dig into some of that stuff, I'd recommend YouTube search for Hank Williams' Mother's Best Flower episodes, or just a Google search, because I think you can find some of them. You might be able to find some of them on archive.org, where you can just download them there instead of just listening on someone's YouTube channel. But I don't remember if I read this list. I typed this up while I was watching the country music documentary from Ken Burns, and I might have written in a couple extras that I found as well. Country stars at the time were known to pitch products like Dr. Legier's Pig Swig or One Day Hog Worm Powder to get the worms out of your hogs. That's not a euphemism. That means like your livestock. Radioactive dirt, baby chicks, standard thing. Liver pills, Cloverine skin calming salve ointment. I apologize if I read this on the previous episode. I usually cross off stuff in my notes once I'm done reading it. And I want to say that I wouldn't have let the whole episode go by without reading this fun list. I'm not even partway. I'm only partway through it. Prayer cloths, monarch flower, staff o-life laying mash. These are like, Blue Chew of the time. Wix, stamps.com for those of you that are listening to various podcasts of the last 10 years. And it was something all radio personalities did, obviously. The big famous ones like Jack Benny, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. They all had their, Orson Welles. Whether it was Campbell's Soup or Lucky Strikes or like one of 4 other cigarette brands for that matter, quite frankly. Everyone had to owe their time on the radio to somebody, and they had to be very clear about it. But that's just the beginning for Hank. There are other deals that and other little side hustles that he had. He's got this book that comes out. He co-writes in 1951 with his friend Jimmy Rule, who was a math teacher at a private Nashville school, who kind of moonlighted as a songwriter when he could. And they published a book called How to Write Folk and Western Music to Sell. You would order it from the Nashville location, I assume straight from Jimmy himself, for one whole Yankee dollar, postage paid. And it was full of advice, if not bad advice, a little ordinary advice, sort of common sense sort of things. Get a good title. Remember the basic types of songs, those about love, novelties, and the Chamber of Commerce songs like Tennessee Waltz. Keep a notebook. Work with 4/4 time. Keep it clean. Watch out for song sharks, which means never pay to have a song published. Then Hank and Audrey opened their own Western wear store in downtown Nashville, also in 1951. It seems like it was less of an investment, more Audrey kind of capitalizing on the fame in a town where stars are involved in selling everything from their records to like their special branded cowboy boots to fried chicken. It was kind of Audrey's thing. It was all set up in her style. There was a fake log cabin exterior, big wagon wheel lamp hanging over the entrance, and a big neon sign with Hank and Audrey on it. WSM made a special sort of broadcast about the opening of the store to announce it to the listening audience. And then they had a performance on the air with Hank, Audrey, Big Bill Lister, and the Drifting Cowboys. And presumably it did the job well enough for folks to come down and peruse the goods in the store or purchase some Hank and Audrey dolls for themselves and their kids. Now let's talk about Hadacol. I may not be pronouncing that correctly, but this is late summer 1951. Hank gets hooked up with a guy who went by the name Dudley Cousin Dud LeBlanc. Cousin, Couzain, like maybe cousin. He is described by one historian as a Mercurio Politico, hyphenated. He had run for governor of Louisiana in 1932. So, 20 years before this little experiment with music on a tour on a train that's about to ensue. His campaign statement back then, I guess, didn't convince enough people. It was, the state needs an honest man and I must make the sacrifice. He went on to be more of a quack, like inventor of fake medical remedies, like Happy Day headache powders and Dixie Dew cough remedy. But Hadacol was where he really struck it big. It was a patent medicine that was 12% alcohol, and as one author, Mr. Kuhn, George William Kuhn, who published the Hank Williams biobibliography, said had to be 88% swamp water. But luckily, Colin Escott's book goes into greater detail about what was sort of thrown together in the mix to make this happen. Because, LeBlanc had, Senator Dudley J. LeBlanc, one-time senator, had thrown together a bunch of different ingredients after getting obsessed with vitamins. He had fallen ill with beriberi, was supposedly cured in 1942 after losing another attempt at earning the governorship. Supposedly cured with vitamin B compounds, and started doing all the research he could about vitamins that was available at the time, then distilling down his own compound in the family barn. So they were vitamins, minerals, honey, and the 12% alcohol. Dubbed Hadacol, a rough acronym for Happy, H-A, Day, D-A, Co, company, C-O, topped off with an L for LeBlanc. So clearly the Happy Day branding is something he's, he wants to keep going with his Happy Day headache powder. It goes on the market in 1945, and he had tested it on himself as well as his cattle and his neighbors. Now, the alcohol content in it was about the same as wine at the time, but it was 4 times as expensive at $3.50 and tasted very, very foul. So many people, sort of believed it must be medicine. Also, it was the closest to booze that a lot of folks out on some of these rural routes could get their hands on legally. So, bottle with a label on it, you buy it as medicine, drink to your heart's content, and probably need some of that headache powder the next day to get your ass to work, I assume. Now, this goes out, like I said, in 1945, but he somehow did become a state senator in 1948. But this just feeds into Hadacol sales because one of the things he was instrumental in doing during that time as a state senator was to get passed a bill called the Old Age Pension Bill. So that gives him this new credibility among older citizens in his potential buying audience. And he carries some authority now to sell them, and other people around the state, presumably, in that age demographic, a ton of this stuff. He uses the money he's getting to just go on an advertising spree, like more aggressive than people would normally see at this time in newspapers. And testimonials, of course, all these are anecdotal. None of them are backed up with any sort of references or, you can't look up who this person is that's giving the testimonial. It's not like Google reviews or Yelp or whatever. This is how they did ads back in the day. And if you've listened to enough old-time radio, you've heard this all the time. You just hear someone just comes on with like a tinny-sounding microphone and says, I use it every day and my headaches have been gone for a year. And they don't say, this is Dr. Evans, or they don't say, like, this is a patient that was, dealing with crippling headaches every day, and his name is so-and-so from Atlanta, Georgia. And even if they did, you can't fact check that. You're just sitting at home listening to the stuff on the radio. I doubt anyone's writing into these newspapers asking for some vetting to be done of these quotes that say things like, I have been suffering from nervousness, weak spells, lack of energy, and never felt like working. Mrs. L.E. Mitchell from Wadsworth, Texas, said in March 1984, supposedly, after taking Hadacol, I'm doing my work better than I have in years. I don't have weak spells. I eat well, and I sleep like a log. Here's the kicker. My little girl didn't eat very much. After taking Hadacol, she eats 2 helpings every meal. We just can't praise it enough. I just wish more people knew how wonderful Hadacol is. Other ads claimed that this stuff would cure cancer, epilepsy, heart trouble, strokes, tuberculosis, etc. To cap it off, these ads would would conclude that this good senator has served his people in public life faithfully and well. In private life, he brings you a service which is appreciated by suffering humanity. Hadacol. Now, we're still a couple years away from hooking up with Hank Williams. We're talking early 49. He gets set up with a guy named Murray Nash, the head of Mercury Records, the southern division of Mercury Records. I asked LeBlanc what was in Hadacol, said Nash, and he told me there was enough alcohol to make people feel good and enough laxative for a good movement. Nash's commercial antennae began twitching. This is straight from the text of Mr. Colin Escott. And he cut 2 Hadacol peans. I assume that's jingles or songs. One for the country market, Bill Nettles' Hadacol Boogie, which charted in June of 49, so 6 months later, presumably. And another for the rhythm and blues market, what they were calling, I guess they were calling it rhythm and blues instead of race records by then. Professor Longhair's Hadacol Bounce. The publicity generated by Hadacol Boogie convinced LeBlanc that country music was an effective medium for promoting his product, so he was primed when Mac Hedrick of WSM approached him with the idea of sponsoring Hank Williams's Health and Happiness shows in October 1949. Even then, Hank was just a bit player on LeBlanc's stage. In 1950, LeBlanc spent more than $1 million a month on advertising, making him the nation's second largest advertiser after Coca-Cola. His enterprise grew to the point that Hadacol was shipped by a wholly owned fleet of trucks from the plants in Lafayette, where the employees were now dressed in a white starched uniform to simulate a lab environment. A far cry from the barn in which Hadacol had been concocted. Sales were astronomical at the peak of the operation in 1950 and 51. So LeBlanc would routinely say there were 4 S's of salesmanship. They were saturation, sincerity, simplicity, and showmanship. And with that last in mind, he comes up with this idea for something called the Hadacol caravan. Mr. Murray Nash claims he gave LeBlanc the idea based on a hillbilly jamboree that he had put together in Tampa. LeBlanc says it came to him at 4:30 in the morning in Abbeville, Louisiana. Regardless, the first one ran in August 1950. This is before Hank Williams joined up. The leaders were Roy Acuff, Connie Boswell, Burns and Allen. Oh, wow. George Burns and Gracie Allen. Check them out if you haven't. If you like old-time comedy on the air from like the 40s and 50s. Great comedy duo. Chico Marx, hell yeah. And Mickey Rooney. Probably my favorite of all the actors to portray Fallout Boy over the years. Jiminy Chillikers. When interviewed back in 1982, let's see, Jerry and Don, 2 of the Driftin' Cowboys, were asked about the Hadacol tour and if it was a good time or not. Don says, let me get their names right. Sorry, folks. Jerry Rivers and Don Helms. There we go. Don says, it was an extravaganza, the biggest show I'd ever seen. When you're 18 or 19 and want to play music, nothing could be better. We were traveling on a private train. All the food you wanted was free. The cleaning was free. A lot of pretty girls hobnobbing with big names. It was a combination of circus, concert, and comedy. And Jerry said, we did not know how big Hank was until we saw him with Bob Hope and Jack Benny. So this is the 1951 caravan, of course, that does include Hank Williams and his boys, also backed up by Minnie Pearl, a comedian named Candy Candido, an MC named Emil Pera, a juggler named Lee Marks, house band led by Tony Martin, a troupe of dancers, and 12 clowns. Other star attractions were to be added later on, like Cesar Romero, Jack Benny, and Rochester from the Jack Benny Show, Milton Berle for crying out loud, Bob Hope for crying out loud, Jimmy Durante for crying out loud, Rudy Valley, and Carmen Miranda, a few others as well that aren't as big in names. They were all, like, we're talking like sometimes just 1 or 2 dates on the tour, though. Let's see. Admission was 1 Hadacol box top if you were a child, 2 for adults. So proof that you've paid for it in the past. There were prizes for kids and, quote, reserved seating for coloreds. Most shows had a parade going on before them, and this was all part of drumming up more attention for LeBlanc because of his new agenda to use the publicity generated by this caravan as a way to launch another run for Louisiana governorship. He feels right now that at the sale of the product and due to all this advertising for the last 6-7 years it's probably peaking right now. And in achieving this peak, he's attracted the attention of certain government agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, the American Medical Association, and the Liquor Control Board. So his crazy advertising budget means that actually the corporation he was running lost $2 million during the second quarter of 1951. So this second round with the caravan is sort of a smokescreen to disguise the true financial picture and also snare some potential buyers. According to Colin Escott, I'm not sure if that implies buyers of the brand, like please come buy my business, or just more potential people, consumers buying the bottles of the stuff. Hank and Bill Lister go into the senator's office before the start of the tour and noted the shelf he has in his office full of Old Forester whiskey with a little subscript on the labels that say, bottled especially for Senator Dudley J. LeBlanc, Lafayette, Louisiana. They have chorus girls on the show. They have a bunch of beauty pageant winners as well as like the Hadacol girls, I guess, being part of the presentation at various points. And the girls are digging Hank. They're watching him perform, and they're a little taken with his friendliness and his willingness to like do a little dancing every now and then and having a good time with them and carousing with them, as opposed to the more high profile celebrity names that were pretty frosty apparently and keeping to themselves and just sort of, probably setting up the next deal further down the road or eager to get back to whatever town that they're broadcasting out of, be it the Los Angeles or New York or whatever. But things weren't all fun for the whole trip, because eventually the checks that the people like Hank and the musicians were given, these big pink checks about 6 inches long and 3 inches high, for something like $7,500. Everyone on the train had been given one, and they all bounced. So Hank and Minnie Pearl took the lead on confronting the senator about this, and they threatened not to return from Nashville unless they were paid. And for a few weeks, LeBlanc had to sort of juggle enough funds around from his other accounts, throw it into the payroll to keep everyone happy. And then from Montgomery, Alabama, they moved on to Georgia. Walter McNeil drives Lily, Hank's mom, to the show all the way up in Columbus so she could sort of take in the triumph of this sort of traveling show that he's headlining. So I'll round this out with just more reading direct from the pages of Colin Escott, because the next few paragraphs are pretty chock full of direct quotes and good information. Band members recall Hank often came back from his weekend furloughs distraught and angry. This is after the caravan had gone through, from Ohio through the Carolinas and into Virginia, etc. He would be hinting broadly that all was not well on Franklin Road. There were rumors Audrey was keeping company with other men, and those rumors gnawed at Hank, despite the fact that he was trying hard to start an affair with one of the dancing girls. He used his failing marriage as an excuse for coming on to her, giving the impression that he wanted to get involved. He took her shopping, bought her some cowboy boots, squired her to the clubs, but she wouldn't give in. Or succumb, Mr. Escott says. When we got to Louisville, Kentucky, said Big Bill Lister, Dick Hames said to his wife, well, we're finally getting out of the sticks. The hillbillies won't be tearing them up now. What he didn't know was that Louisville was a second home to a lot of Opry acts. Somebody played there every Sunday afternoon on the way to somewhere. Bob Hope joined the show for 2 appearances in Louisville and Cincinnati. Hank had been closing the show up to that point, but LeBlanc asked him to take second billing, and Hank agreed. To make things as difficult as possible for Hope, Hank reached back for something extra and took encore after encore. That crowd wasn't going to turn him loose, says Lister, and LeBlanc was trying to introduce Bob Hope all over this hollering and clapping. They got the crowd quieted down. Somewhere in his wardrobe, Bob Hope had this old hat that he'd used in Paleface, and he wore that and just stood there. When the place quieted down, he said, just call me Hank Hope. When he came off, Hope found LeBlanc and told him he wouldn't follow Hank Williams again. Hank could afford to smile inwardly, but being Hank, he probably smiled outwardly as well, because the triumph was nothing if not to be savored. When LeBlanc told him he was topping the bill, Hank said, that's fine, just pay me what you're paying Hope. Lister and everyone else in Hank's entourage had less charitable memories of Milton Berle, who appeared on the show in St. Louis. Uncle Milty, Lister recalls, had offered to MC the entire show, in addition to performing his usual shtick. He had a big ego, as big as all outdoors. And when Dick Hames was doing Old Man River, Milton Berle had a red bandana around his head and stood out behind Dick Hames and just ruined the man's act. Nobody deserves that. Uncle Milty had already been out, done his thing, and now he was ruining everybody else's act. I told Hank, if that joker comes out doing that when we're out there, he's really going to mess things up. If he wants a good laugh, I'm going to get this old guitar and crown him with it. Hank said, if you do, I'll buy you any guitar you want. But the word circulated around, and Milton's manager got him plumb off stage somewhere. And to clarify my question earlier, it seems that the end of the tour does bring about the desired result for Mr. LeBlanc. It is indeed his intention to sell his company. So they are rounding things up in, September 17th, before the show was scheduled for the Cotton Bowl. Next morning, we're having breakfast, remembered Bill Lister, and Hank asked the senator, "What did you sell Hadacol for?" Because it's been sold off to the Toby Maltz Company in New York. He meant, why did you sell it? So he misspoke when he asked the question. But the senator leaned across the table and said, $8.5 million. And our jaws just dropped to the floor. Then they were handed their final paychecks soon after, at the end of the tour, and they tried to cash them again. Once again, LeBlanc did not include enough money in the accounts to cover the payroll for the musicians and performers. Some of the dancers had been just living without spending their money on the train. They had sent their $90 check back home, so it couldn't get spent on the tour, and ended up in Juarez and had to ride a cattle car back to L.A. Hank would fly back to Nashville and fly Don Helms and Sammy Pruitt to Lafayette to pick up their limos. The limos for the band, I guess, probably owned by Hank. He gave Jerry Rivers and Howard Watts train tickets back to Nashville. Turns out, though, LeBlanc saw no more than $250,000 for Hadacol because payments of $500,000 a month from future profits were called for but weren't made because there were no future profits. Only liens, overdue bills, return shipments, and FTC and Liquor Control Board suits. LeBlanc's explanation for this was, if you sell a cow and the cow dies, you can't do anything to a man for that. Hadacol, as a company, was officially declared bankrupt in 1952 at the height of his next failed campaign to become governor. Now, since this episode has dealt with your cheating heart as a cinematographic account of Hank Williams' life, I wanted to go into some of the notes that I read from Mr. Kuhn in his Hank Williams biobibliography book. He says, the arts have had a difficult time dealing with Hank. Their versions of him are valuable to researchers only as they reflect the problems involved in dramatizing a life that was so intensely romantic in its own right. Whether or not this observation can be accepted as a general rule, turning the truth to fiction almost always seems to diminish the dramatic qualities of Hank Williams' life. Another problem is that the most artistic treatments of the South and of country music have been simple-minded in their depiction of good old boys and girls and their antics, until recently, when we got a sensible film version of Loretta Lynn's life in Coal Miner's Daughter. So that tells you, about when this book is published. Your Cheatin' Heart, 1964, a low-budget MGM film, is typical in both regards. Its little drama pales beside the reality, and the very idea that George Hamilton could play Hank Williams is far-fetched. Roger Williams offers amusing praise when he says that Hamilton is perhaps a better choice to play Hank than Sammy Davis Jr. And Susan Oliver's Audrey makes one think he is watching a Sandra Dee movie, something on the order of Tammy Goes to Nashville. Not gonna lie, that one's way over my head. Plot is no stronger than the cast. Hank sings Jesus Loves Me as T-Tot dies in his arms. Then he deserts a medicine show to join Audrey's band, the Drifting Cowboys. Hank plays out his part as the mischievous drunk falling off a horse while celebrating the birth of Hank Jr., singing with backup music reminiscent of Ray Conniff and finally drying out only to pass away in the back of his car. Notably absent from the film are Hank's divorce from Audrey and his marriage to Billie Jean. That Audrey was MGM's technical advisor may explain the oversights. The $1.2 million film premiered at Montgomery's Paramount Theater on the 4th of November, 1964. Stars like Johnny Cash, Tex Ritter, and Roy Acuff put on a 2-hour stage show for the occasion. Governor George Wallace contributed by declaring Hank Williams Week. The film went on to produce a good return for its backers until Billie Jean filed the suits discussed in the biographical essay. That's earlier in the book. Paul Schrader, who wrote American Gigolo, Taxi Driver, and Raging Bull, prepared a script for a more recent film based on Hank's life, but the film has never been made. During his research for Your Cheatin' Heart, Chet Flippo discussed the script with Schrader and called it explosive, and then suggested that it's too raunchy for Hollywood. That was in the Greenville News, South Carolina, April 1981. The only real evidence of Hank in Hollywood then continues to be in his songs, which dominate the soundtrack of The Last Picture Show. And my first thought was like, oh, that's that semi-disastrous film that Dennis Hopper made after he did Easy Rider. Maybe not right after Easy Rider, but no, that was called The Last Movie. Peter Bogdanovich, of the same sort of era or graduating class of young Hollywood upstarts of the time, made The Last Picture Show. And this was an adaptation of a Larry McMurtry novel, the guy that wrote Lonesome Dove, among many other beloved cowboy yarns. And it had Timothy Bottoms as Sonny, Jeff Bridges, more notably, as Dwayne, and the I think this is the first big splash made by Sybil Shepherd as JC, if I remember correctly. It's a black and white movie. She looks very young in it. I think it's a few years before Taxi Driver, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I am. Call in. Correct me now. You've got 30 seconds because I'm wrapping up the show. Thank you so much for being here on my first show back in the new year after the first break I've ever taken in over 2 years of working on the show. It's always a delight to sort of get down into the research. I feel better for having done so. Again, I feel like myself again. I don't know. That coupled with some more exercise makes me feel like myself again. Thank you for being along for the ride. I will be carrying this over into at least one more episode for The Last Ride. And I Saw the Light. Maybe even The Night Hank Williams Came to Town, which I found on YouTube, which is a Canadian film starring someone who looks more like, Gerald Briscoe than Hank Williams. And that reference is for two people who watched professional wrestling in the early 2000s and also like Hank Williams and listen to this show. Please remember that you deserve to be happy and you deserve to be loved and you deserve the space and the time to work on things that make you a better person and make you a whole person and help you to get better at something, anything. Please also remember that you should definitely be sharing this show with other people you like or dislike. If you found a certain episode you know they would not be entertained by, that's fine by me. You are strongly encouraged to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Things like that would be great. I love the feedback. I've had a couple that were very nice already, but could stand some more. It's been more than 2 years. I'd like to see some more feedback from the audience as long as it's positive. No negative feedback ever. Please don't criticize me for anything I've ever done in my life, especially this podcast. I wouldn't be able to handle it. Take care of yourself. Be kind when you can. I understand this is longer than my usual outro, but I've been away for a couple months, for crying out loud. What do you want from me? overflowing with emotion and directives for you. Trying to tell you how to live your life here. Takes longer than others sometimes. But through it all, always remember that rock and roll is just the best. And so are you.